In the past few weeks, readers of Southeast Asian newspapers and people on social media all over the world may have come across a long-running dispute and rather unexpected headlines. In mid-July of this year, 2022, many woke up to the headlines about the unexpected move to seize Malaysian government assets around the world. This involves the ongoing legal claims of the heirs of the Sultan of Sulu to an enormous financial settlement from the government of Malaysia. What shocked many was that the sum involved is an eye-watering $14.9 billion. But the implications of the case stretch far beyond the Sultan's descendants themselves. It all relates to the region now known as Sabah, aka North Borneo, and it also involves a long-running dispute between the Federation of Malaysia and the Republic of the Philippines. So where exactly is Sabah, and why are countries still fighting over it? Mabuhay! Or in Kapampangan, luwid kayo! Welcome back to another history video. It is me, Kirby Araullo, your friendly Pinoy historian. And if you are new to my channel, in this channel I make videos about our people's history, culture, and everything in between from the Philippines and across Southeast Asia. So welcome to part 1 of my 3-part series about Sabah, aka North Borneo. And in today's video, we'll be going over an overview of the history behind the Sabah dispute. So why exactly are we talking about Sabah? I understand that today's topic is complicated and quite controversial, but I do hope that this series of videos about Sabah will help many of you to dig deeper and understand this issue better. So I'll be including a list of credible sources and recommended readings for those of you who are genuinely interested to learn more. Let me also just clarify that today's video does not necessarily reflect my own stand and my own personal opinions regarding the matter, but rather, as a historian, this is my way of providing my viewers with a better understanding of the history behind the dispute over Sabah. And again, this is just part 1, the first among a series of videos I plan on making regarding this topic. And then in part 2, we will be digging deeper into the historical roots of this conflict and the pre-colonial history of Sabah, Sulu, Brunei, and what are now Malaysia and the Philippines. And after that, in part 3, we will be learning more about the recent developments and explore the modern-day social, geopolitical, and humanitarian impacts of this issue, including the recent arbitration ruling. So stay tuned for more, and if you want to help me make more videos like this to support my channel and my research, please be my patron on Patreon or be a member of my YouTube channel, or get copies of any of my books, coloring books, and ebooks, or any of the merch linked down below. Maraming salamat po, or in Bahasa Melayu, terima kasih. So where exactly is Sabah, and why are countries still fighting over it? So for those who may not be familiar, Sabah is a region abundant in oil. In fact, its capacity is equivalent to about 40% of Malaysia's crude oil production. The land of Sabah, abundant in natural resources like oil, gas, timber, palm oil, and many more, lies on the northern end of the island of Borneo in Southeast Asia, located just south of the Philippines. And currently, it is also a state in the Federation of Malaysia, and literally less than an hour sail from the Sulu archipelago. Historically speaking, throughout the pre-colonial and colonial period, Sabah, aka North Borneo, had been the source of a territorial dispute between the sultans of Sulu and Brunei. Both sultanates emerged in the period of Islamic expansion across Southeast Asia in the 1300s and the 1400s. On one hand, the Sultanate of Brunei was established by Sultan Muhammad Shah in the 1360s, with its power base located on the western coast of Borneo, and it eventually conquered much of the island of Borneo, particularly the coastal regions. The Sultanate of Sulu, on the other hand, emerged from the Sulu archipelago, founded in the 1400s by the revered Muslim scholar and explorer Sultan Sharif ul Hashim, who was also a known descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. The Sultanate of Sulu would later expand to include the surrounding islands of what is now southern Philippines and the coastal areas of Borneo in what are now Malaysia and Indonesia. By the 1500s, 1600s, the royal houses of Brunei and Sulu were practically united. This was a direct result of the union between Sultan Bolkiah of Brunei and Putri Leila Mentionai of Sulu in the late 1400s. And I already made a video about them, their legendary love story, and their impact in the history of Southeast Asia, so make sure to check it out after this video. However, this political unity of Sulu and Brunei would eventually disintegrate, and conflict would soon brew between the descendants of Sultan Bolkiah and Putri Leila Mentionai, as Sulu became increasingly more powerful, while around the same time, recurring internal conflicts plagued the royal court in Brunei. Nonetheless, unknown to many, despite such rivalries, these intermarriages between the royal houses of Sulu, Brunei, and Luzon would still continue on for generations, if not for centuries. Thereafter, in the 1600s and especially in the 1700s, the region we now call Sabah, along with other territories like the island of Palawan, became a major source of dispute between the rival powers. And again, in part 2 of this series, we will do a deeper dive about this earlier conflict and learn more about how Sabah or North Borneo, how it was given by the Sultan of Brunei as a gift to the Sultan of Sulu in the late 1600s. Now, the origins of the modern-day dispute over Sabah lie in an agreement that was made in 1878 between the nascent British North Borneo Company and the Sultan of Sulu. The British North Borneo Company, aka the North Borneo Chartered Company, was a British colonial trade and development company that during this time was just being established by Alfred and Edward Dent in partnership with the German businessman and diplomat Baron Gustav von Overbeck. Unknown to many, there were actually several agreements that pertain to the territory we now call Sabah in the late 1870s. So the first one was between the British Company and Sultan Abdul Mumin of Brunei in December of 1877, and then another one between the British Company and Sultan Jamal ul Azam, aka Sultan Jamal ul Alam of Sulu the following month in January of 1878. It is also important to note that contrary to popular belief, especially in the Philippines, the disputed part of Sabah or North Borneo is actually not the entire modern-day Malaysian state of Sabah, but actually the northern and the eastern regions of North Borneo or Sabah, as shown in this map submitted to the International Court of Justice or ICJ in 2001. But anyway, back to 1878, the British North Borneo Company wanted to have access to what was otherwise an undeveloped region surrounded by waters teeming with so-called pirates, for the simple reason that there was a lot of rubber available in North Borneo. And then over the next several decades, they would make an enormous amount of money from the rubber industry and the production of other goods like tobacco and coconuts. Much of this was driven by the rubber boom of the early 1900s due to Henry Ford's automobile revolution that took hold at a particularly highly profitable time. So while the British North Borneo Company was making a lot of money in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a dispute was also humming along in the background. In 1878, when the company had come into possession of Sabah, it was not entirely clear to the British who this part of Borneo even belonged to in order to officially grant it away. Hence, the two separate agreements, one between the British Company and the Sultan of Brunei for the western coast of Sabah, and another one between the British Company and the Sultan of Sulu for the northern and the eastern regions of Sabah, which actually pretty much makes up the majority of the North Borneo territory. But we will talk more about this in my next video, so stay tuned. Now, to make matters even more confusing, the legal documents which were involved in the 1878 agreement were either intentionally or unintentionally poorly worded, with the result that it is still a matter of considerable legal debate today. You know, whether the agreement constituted a lease of the land, aka renting the land from the Sultan of Sulu, or an outright cession or sale of the land in the form of a lease in perpetuity. And as a result of all of this, from the 1880s onwards and up until the present day, as we've seen in the recent headlines, legal battles are still being fought to this very day. Okay, so the British took over Sabah in the 1800s, but then they left after World War II. So what exactly happened after World War II? Let's find out. The Sabah dispute took on an even greater significance in the aftermath of World War II. The island of Borneo had been absolutely devastated during the war, and the British North Borneo Company immediately closed up its business. Sabah then became the British Crown Colony of North Borneo, and it remained as such until 1963, when Sabah, along with the other British colonies in Southeast Asia, was fully included in the creation of the independent Federation of Malaysia. In anticipation of this move to include Sabah in the creation of a new country called Malaysia, the Philippine government, which by now included Sulu, had begun pressing its claim over Sabah, and this official claim of the Republic of the Philippines began under President Diosdado Macapagal in 1962. Macapagal officially initiated the claim right before the formation of what is now the Federation of Malaysia in 1963. Interestingly, unknown to many, Diosdado Macapagal was himself a direct descendant of Sultan Bolkiah of Brunei and Putri Laila Mentionai of Sulu, through Macapagal's own ancestor, Lakadula of Tondo. And in the early 1960s, Sultan Muhammad Esmail Kiram of Sulu sought the help of a very distant cousin, then Philippine President Diosdado Macapagal, regarding Sulu's claim over Sabah. And thus, in 1962, the Sultanate of Sulu officially ceded to the Republic of the Philippines the rights to the title of sovereignty and dominion over North Borneo or Sabah. Now, this claim has a strong historical and legal basis, which we will be discussing in Part 2 and Part 3 of this series. But it is also worth noting that as early as the 1940s and the 1950s, the Philippines was already pursuing its own claim over Sabah. So unknown to many, in 1878, around the same time that the British North Borneo Company was acquiring control over what is now Sabah, the Sultan of Sulu had also entered an agreement with the Spanish Crown, making the Sultanate of Sulu officially a protectorate of the Spanish Empire. Now, to confuse things even further, Spain subsequently signed the Madrid Protocol with the British and the Germans in 1885, recognizing that Sabah was an area of British influence. As such, Malaysia and the Philippines both have numerous claims and counterclaims through which they could argue that Sabah was their territory in international law. And so, in the late 1960s, it appeared as though the dispute over Sabah could escalate into a full-blown war, as the regime of Macapagal's successor, then Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Sr., secretly began arming militants in the Philippines with the goal of launching a small-scale invasion of North Borneo, and this plot was known as Operation Merdeka. However, this never materialized, as the young men which were being trained for Operation Merdeka mutinied, leading to the infamous Jabida Massacre in 1968 and the subsequent uprisings in the Muslim-majority regions of southern Philippines. And you can learn more about this in a separate video I made about Operation Merdeka just a few months ago, so if you haven't seen it yet, make sure to watch it after this video. Interestingly, in 1977, during the ASEAN Summit held in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, Philippine President Marcos Sr. declared his intentions to drop the claim over Sabah. Thereafter, tensions between Malaysia and the Philippines somewhat cooled down. But in reality, the Philippines has never officially dropped its claim over Sabah. Indeed, it was even reaffirmed by the Philippine Supreme Court in 2011. Now, for its part, Malaysia insists that the sovereign status of Sabah is a non-issue. The Philippines, on the other hand, had tried to bring up the case and settle the issue in international courts, but Malaysia is unwilling to enter into negotiations concerning the matter. Now, the other ever-running dispute, of course, concerns the rights of the heirs and descendants of the Sultan of Sulu to the annual payments for Sabah as stipulated in the 1878 agreement, and their claim is bolstered by the fact that the British North Borneo Company paid the Sultans of Sulu for the rights to Sabah in 1878 and continued to pay for the control of the region every year since then. And since the 1960s, these legal claims have been made against the Federation of Malaysia, which, as the successor to the British interests in the region, is liable for the sum owed to the heirs and the descendants of the Sultan of Sulu. Unknown to many, even to the people in Malaysia and in the Philippines, these annual payments were made every year from 1878 until 2013. But continuing litigation resulted in the international arbitration ruling that Malaysia owed $14.9 billion to the heirs of the Sultan of Sulu in 2022. So if they were still paying from 1878 to 2013, Then what exactly happened in 2013? Why did Malaysia stop paying the heirs of the Sultan of Sulu in 2013? In a surprising and somewhat bizarre new episode in the long-running dispute over Sabah, an armed encounter occurred in 2013 between the Malaysian military against a group of approximately 200 armed men from Sulu. These men were the followers of the late Jamalul Kiram III, a claimant to the title of Sultan of Sulu and who was among the descendants of the 9 principal heirs of Sultan Jamalul Kiram II, the last sovereign sultan of an independent sultanate of Sulu. However, it is also worth noting that since the death of Sultan Mahakota Kiram of Sulu in 1986, there has been a succession crisis to the throne and the title of Sultan of Sulu. But this did not mean that there were no legal heirs of Sultan Jamalul Kiram II to whom the annual payments for Sabah are legally owed to according to the 1878 agreement. In fact, as mentioned earlier, the annual payments continued until 2013. Nevertheless, the 2013 Lahad-Datu incident resulted in dozens of casualties, a military standoff, and a diplomatic crisis. Consequently, the Malaysian government stopped the annual payments to the descendants of the Sultan of Sulu, regardless of their involvement or innocence in the armed encounter. And thus, the dispute involving the annual payments owed to the heirs of the Sultan of Sulu by Malaysia, just like the dispute over the sovereignty of Sabah between the Federation of Malaysia and the Republic of the Philippines, seems no closer to a resolution in 2022 than it has ever been over the last several decades. It just goes to show that a poorly worded legal document rooted in colonialism and unclear land tenure can have long-lasting consequences. And sadly, throughout the mainstream narrative of this conflict, very little attention is given to the native and indigenous people of Sabah and the Sulu archipelago. Millions of marginalized people on both sides of the border who were sadly caught in the middle of the seemingly never-ending crisis, a conflict caused by centuries of colonialism and decades of modern-day geopolitics. And one more thing before I go, since we all know how many tend to get heated in the comment section of any videos mentioning Sulu or Sabah, before you get angry, let me just make it clear that I am not saying that we do not have a claim over Sabah, but within the context of these historical events, Sabah is technically still de facto part of Malaysia. Regardless of the validity and the strength of our claims, the world currently sees Sabah as de facto part of Malaysia, which means that the Federation of Malaysia has effective control over Sabah and the legal jurisdiction over its citizens. We must also remember that international law requires countries like the Philippines to pursue such claims and disputes through diplomatic or peaceful means. Therefore, any unilateral use of force, such as the attempted Operation Merdeka by Ferdinand Marcos Sr. in 1968 and even the Lahad-Datu incident in 2013, could be interpreted, especially by Malaysia, as an invasion or an act of violence against the territorial integrity of another nation-state. Just to be clear, I am not saying that we do not have a rightful claim over Sabah. As a historian and a direct descendant of both the Sultans of Sulu and the Sultans of Brunei, I fully understand the strength of our historical claims over North Borneo. But also, as someone who diligently studied international law, I also understand the precarious nature and the complexities of this dispute, because nothing in this dispute is black and white. And to be honest, my main concern in this whole issue, in this decades-long conflict, my main concern are the rights and the well-being of the people caught in the middle. Millions of marginalized people on both sides of the border in both Sabah and the Sulu archipelago. So stay tuned for my next videos as we dig deeper into the long history of this conflict and get a better understanding of its impact on the people, particularly the local and indigenous people of Sulu and North Borneo. And that is it for me today. So let me know what you think about today's topic in the comments below. And again, this is just part 1 of my 3-part series about the dispute over Sabah, aka North Borneo. So stay tuned for parts 2 and 3 to dig deeper and learn more. And of course, if you like this video or learn a thing or two, don't forget to like, share this video, comment down below, and please subscribe. Help me reach that 100,000 subscribers mark by the end of this year so more people can learn more about our people's history, culture, and everything in between from the Philippines and across Southeast Asia. But of course, before we go, today's shoutout goes to Sham Aris from Malaysia, Johan from Indonesia, Anjo from the Philippines, Ryan Fillmore from California, and special shoutout and special thanks to my patron on Patreon, Jake Vermas. Isang taus-pusong pasasalamat sa inyong lahat. Of course, this video, this channel will not be possible without the love and the support of all my patrons and all my subscribers throughout these years. Anyapin dakalpong salamat kay Kongan, or in bahasa Sug, magsukol tuod kay mo, and in bahasa Melayu, terima kasih. See you next time, or in Tagalog kita-kits and in Kapampangan, Mikitiks, and in bahasa Sug, Banikisab, and in bahasa Melayu, Jum palagi.